Welcome to the Doctrine of Salvation, module number 7, important and intertestamental developments. Why would we study the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew for a doctrine of salvation? It's pretty simple. It's that, and your preacher does this probably every other Sunday. He'll say, well, in Matthew, we have a Pharisee. What is that? It wasn't in the Old Testament, and he'll mention it or describe how a Pharisee shows up in the New Testament, but not in the Old. So the point is that when you turn to from Malachi to Matthew, Matthew's audience and Matthew the writer is expecting you to have known what happened for 400 years. Otherwise, he would not make sense, right? So what we need to do in a doctrine of salvation to be fair to the story of what Israel was going through is to look at what is there, even though it's not part of our Bible. Proposition number 1, Israel experienced, as I say, 400 years, about 400 years of what we're going to call prophetic silence between Malachi and Matthew. It's one page in your Bible and 400 years, more than the history of the United States happens. By the way, this is not just here. This also happens between Genesis and Exodus. About 280 some years pass as you turn one page, as Israel is in Egypt. So the idea of prophetic silence is not new to the Bible. It's just that it's more pronounced between Malachi and Matthew. But notice, we don't want to call it silent in this sense. Far from being silent, it was, what word do we want? I choose convulsive. I would add the word chaotic, both politically and theologically. So much going on in this time period that, again, we need to know to make sense of the story of salvation. This is from Maccabees. Maccabees is a book that is not in our Bibles, but Jews revere is too strong. Appreciate the book because it's very historical. It gives, with Josephus, for example, our background for what happened during this period. And so you have verses like this. This is Maccabees 4:6. Until there should come a prophet to show what should be done, until there should be coming a prophet. There was a time even secular Jews knew there was no prophet in the land. First Maccabees 9:27, same idea, that they were not having a prophet in their midst yet, since the time that a prophet has not been seen among them. 1441, again, this idea that until there should arise a prophet. The point is, even secular Jews knew this was a time that God was not working with the nation when it came to a prophetic voice, like a Samuel, a Gad, a Nathan, these prophets of the Old Testament, some named, some not, or some writing prophets, others, of course, not writing prophets, but that was how Israel understood God's voice, was through these prophets. Well, proposition number 2, politically, a sense of heightened nationalism enveloped Israel as foreign powers controlled the region. Jews have done, well, let's go both ways, amazingly well at foreign domination. Think of the Holocaust and that time that was leading up to that time period in American or worldwide history. At the same time, Jews have not done well in the sense of giving in to foreign pressure. And this time period between the Testaments is a good example of that. What happens is, and you could have expected this. I would not blame Jews for thinking this way. We're going to call it tribalism. This idea that, well, if you're going to be pressing in on us as a foreign culture, what we're going to do is press back with the love of ourselves and our people, and we're going to put our nose to the grindstone and become more tight as a nation than ever before. And I'd recommend this starts as early as Ezra and Nehemiah, who are leaders of the what he would call it, the return back to Israel at the end of the Old Testament. Don't think of Nehemiah and Ezra as inspired writers, that everything they did was correct. I think we have to be fair to the story, that when we read this in Nehemiah 13, in fact, let's do it. I contended, this is at the end of Nehemiah. Imagine this. I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them and pulled out their hair. It sounds like the British Parliament. And made them swear by God, saying, you shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. And I cleanse them of everything pagan. I sense in that more than just, it would be good if you didn't marry foreign wives. They're having an all-out brawl with hair being pulled out. I don't sense that. Have you ever had sermon series on how Nehemiah is a great leader? I'd say skip this section. This is not what great leaders do. And notice what it ends with. This is at the very end of the book. We have a nationalism that has turned into, yea, a tribalism, that you're not going to have that wife. I don't care how much you love her. You're not going to have her because she is not of a Jewish descent. Same thing happens in Ezra, if you look for it. Now, therefore, he said, Ezra did at the end, make confession to the Lord God of your fathers and do his will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the pagan wives. And all the assembly said, yes, we'll do it. Imagine if you're one of the wives and you heard your husband standing up and shouting, yes, I'm going to get rid of Mabel. Well, wait a second. You married me. You gave me a covenant. Now they realize we're talking Jew and Gentile. But think what it would have been like to hear your husband shouting a theological, well, really it's a political statement. I'm going to get rid of all these. And by the way, the children as well were being kicked out of these homes. And I think it's just a scary moment in the history of Israel at the very tail end of our Old Testament canon, where we sense that this idea of nationalism has turned a corner in a bad direction. Proposition 3, a fierce, and here's where, again, it's going to go, a fierce concept of the other developed during this period. Exceeding, this is the intertestamental period, exceeding the angst that Israelites had felt for non-Jews during any time in their history. If you go back and read the Old Testament stories, Leviticus, Numbers, and such, well, it starts in Genesis, where God, remember, says this, that I will curse him who curses you. That's part of the memory of the Jew when it comes to the Abrahamic covenant. If someone curses you, I'll get him. Well, Jews hung on to that because as you even go through the law of the Old Testament, you get this sense of, well, the outsider, someone, and there's no one term in Hebrew that you can hone in on and say that, like goyim, the other, or the goy is a common term for a Jew of a pagan or a non-Jew. I'm a goy because I'm of the goyim because I'm Swedish. But in the Old Testament, you had this language of us versus them. And even when you think of Passover, what a beautiful celebration, right? Passover, you sit around the table and remember God's deliverance. If you had a non-Jew in your house, you have to start the service by saying, "Can you leave now? We're having Passover." So, again, very. If you start looking for it, you'll see all these little bits and nuggets of times when Israel was starting in seed form the idea of, wait a second, are you uncircumcised? Then I can't be around you. And it only heightens. That's the point, that we get through the Old Testament to the point of the intertestamental period. And this feeling of angst is very strong. I think it's fair to say this and fair to think about this. What would it have been like to be the other? In our world of inclusion and diversity, I work at a big bank right now, and we are all about, I see it every day on our team page, right? That comes up when I sign in the morning. Inclusivity, diversity. The beauty of that is the opposite of this, where in this day you could speak against the other with all the vitriol you wanted, and it was considered good. At least today we're toning that down, right? Well, and it's good to think in terms of how it felt to be the other person. Let me read this to you. That other person, the one who is destined to not be blessed by Yahweh because of the other God he or she chooses to worship, which isn't a good thing, but just think of how it felt, is a near silent partner in almost every story of the Old Testament. Imagine when we have a soldier surrendering to Joshua's genocide. How would that have felt to watch my family get destroyed and you kill my wife in front of me? I'm going to hate you, right? If you've ever traveled to Israel, I've done this numerous times, where you sense that there's not a bitterness that's being expressed on the street, but the Palestinian and the Jew walk side by side, or different sides of the streets commonly, to go to work. And there's a angst there. Where does it come from? How does it feel to be the other? Or the widow, as I have here, who loses her husband to one of David's military campaigns. We begin to sense how deeply held animosities would certainly have developed through the biblical narrative. And we need to feel that in order to understand the story of salvation. When John 4:9 has this woman of Samaria talking to Jesus, the author, John, adds at the very end, and it's not said for just filling out the page, he wants you to feel this. Jews don't talk to Samaritans. And so this is where this is in John, so this is New Testament, but think of where we got to from here. How did we get to this position? It's the intertestamental period. Well, number 4, a discernible vocabulary even develops on how to speak of this other person. It starts in the Old Testament descriptions, but it goes quite far beyond it to the point that we're going to be talking about the other in very non-neutral terms. Like I say, it starts in the Old Testament. This is a beautiful passage, but remember what you're really doing is choosing sides, like on the soccer field as a 5th grader. As you're choosing who's going to be on what side, because you get the wicked on one, who's on the other side, well, they get the term righteous. And that's how the Old Testament will define this. You're ungodly, you're wicked, or you're righteous. Well, that's an awfully strong word, right? Ungodly or wicked, or a sinner, but that's just the term they used. So we have so much in the New Testament thinking, and modern Christians, we say, for all have sinned, and we think that sinned means everyone's a sinner. That's not how they thought. Of course we all sin, but a sinner is the guy on the other team. He's a guy who's a non-Jew. Philo is an Alexandrian Jew living just after the days of Jesus. He's a philosopher, and you can buy his complete works. It's about that thick today. He writes in Greek, but he writes as a Jew, explaining the history of his people to his Alexandrian audience. Okay, so he's writing after the after the intertestamental period, granted, but the things he expresses again have been fomenting for years. So we read Philo not just to understand his period, but how we got to that period from the Old Testament. And I'm not going to read this all, of course, to you, but he is just look in bold at some of the things he says about the pagan, the other, in grievous error. Let's yes, just for time, look at the very bottom. For they, it's the non-Jew, have cut away the most beautiful support of the soul, namely the proper conception of the ever-living God. Therefore, like ships without ballast, what a picture, they are tossed about in every direction. He's defining what it is to be pagan or non-Jewish. Blind, being blind, respecting that which is worth seeing. They're blind. That's not an Old Testament term for the non-believer, for the non-Yahwist. It becomes one during the intertestamental period. More miserable life than those who are deprived of their bodily sight. Youch. Bottom, not only dimmed the eye of their soul, but have chosen utterly to discard it, being punished as being wicked. There's that word again. Even an infant child would understand, namely, that the Creator is better than the creature. And then at the very end, he just says, oh, by the way, these are not the worst points of all, bad as they are. I've known a lot of these pagans, and they're even worse than I'm describing to you. Do you sense, again, this is in Jesus' day, that we have a Jewish philosopher talking this openly or painful choice of words for his enemy. So the other concept now has turned into a vocabulary, literally, that they're using across the divide. By the time you get to the New Testament, again, for all have sinned. I know that, but is everyone a sinner? No. Everyone is not a sinner. Who are the sinners? They are the ones who are the outsiders, the others in the days of Jesus. The tax collectors and sinners, a specific group of people, drew near to Jesus to hear him. This man receives sinners. They must have been speaking of a specific group. Notice how Paul defines them in Galatians 2. Oh, Gentiles, sinners of the Gentiles. They're the other, okay? And notice that tax collectors are also considered other because when you were a tax collector, you had to forego your Jewish heritage. You had to give up being a Jew in a sense because you sided with Rome. You're the guy showing up at the door wanting Rome's money, Rome's taxes. So that's why a tax collector could be Jewish and still be considered, shall we say, an outsider or even a Gentile. An ethnoi is the Greek term. Again, notice how they talk. We know that God does not hear sinners. What's the opposite? You're a Yahwist. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and I think we need to be consistent. It helps me read Romans better. When we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Who is he talking about? Well, who is he talking to? Gentile believers in Rome, a largely Gentile church. The sinners in Romans 5:8 is not everybody. The sinners are the Roman Christians who are outside the Jewish family. They know that. They're not Jewish. But Paul is explaining to them, and we'll get here, why they can be rejoicing in Jesus, because Christ died for them. Well, of course, we've talked about this idea of the divide. Let me show it this way too. This is all intertestamental thought and where we've come. If you're in Abraham's family, you're blessed, as we read. If you're on the other side, of course, you're cursed. Another way to say it, in covenant, out of covenant. This all starts with Genesis 12:3. So they thought it was a biblical way of thinking. The problem was they started to identify themselves not by their Yahwism, but by their traditions. So now you could know who's a Jew, not by their heart, but by things they did on a Saturday morning or what feasts they showed up to. Do you see the problem? They're starting to misidentify themselves as Jews because of their traditions. Well, then the common sense idea is if I see someone not going to Sabbath service at the synagogue on Saturday, then I know he must be cursed because he's not following my traditions. You'd wish to hear he's not loving Yahweh, but they started thinking in terms of just traditions, and that was a mistake. So what happens, though, if a person, let's do that again. What happens if one of these people on the cursed side wants to become a family member or come across the divide and be part? Let's say this person likes Yahweh. He wants to change to the worship of Yahweh, a Cornelius, to use a man in the New Testament. The problem is he's still cursed. You can't just decide in their thinking, this is how they thought, you can't just decide to show up and be a Yahwist with me if you don't do, oops, I just had it, all those things that we do, kosher. You can't eat a pig in front of me and love Yahweh. That's just how it's going to be. That's just the way they thought. This is from a Jewish prayer. Now it dates to no later than 150. So again, we're talking past the days of Jesus even. The 19th prayer of the Amidah, which is one of the prayers of the Jews. But the point is, this is how Jews prayed in the ancient world, and it probably predates this by some years. Listen to how they talk again about the outsider. For slanderers, this is a prayer. This is one of their prayers. For slanderers, may there be no hope, and may all wickedness quickly be destroyed, and may all our enemies be cut off swiftly. The intentional sinners, swiftly may they be uprooted, broken, cast down, and subdued swiftly in our days. Blessed are you, Lord, breaker of enemies and subduer. I mean, imagine praying this on a Sunday morning about your non-Christian friends. But that's how Jews prayed for the guys on the right. They are to be destroyed. This is what Galatians 3 will call the curse of the law. The law cursed them. Genesis 12:3 curses people over there. And so Paul is going to talk about that curse of the law being undone by Jesus, but we won't talk about that now because we have our next point. Number 5. Could the other be righteous? Let's review where we've come. Could the other person be righteous? The guy on the other side. Sure. Cornelius is righteous. I have no problem with that. By the way, Saul, if you remember from our last lecture, he was a Jew who came to my classroom once. He would have called me a righteous Gentile, and he'd have no trouble with that. I'm not Jewish, though, so I'm not going to be resurrected. The resurrection is the inheritance of the Jew. So what will I do in my afterlife? If God wants me, he'll give me a happy, but I won't resurrect. See, so the Jews have a very careful way of thinking through what you get or not get based upon your family heritage. So could the other be righteous? Yes. Could he be saved? No, because remember where we've been. This two-step salvation. The outsider was righteous, but was considered unclean as long as he remains Gentile. And we've had this before, but just to remind yourself, you can be righteous to Yahweh, that's your faith, but if you want to go to his sacred space, which is in the temple in that time period, your second step of salvation would be to get clean on the way. 2 steps, the Gentile can't go here because he's a Gentile. He's not practicing the law the way a Jew wanted him to. Number 6, unlike their Old Testament ancestors, diaspora Jews became known for, diaspora just means those who are spread around the world during the intertestamental period. They became known for their missionary activity. Now, you don't meet this in the Old Testament except in Jonah, where a man leaves his hometown and tells pagans about Yahweh. But they do seem to get involved here. Jesus even talks about going and spreading the word and becoming, guilty for that. Their intent, however, coincided with religions around the world. Everybody did this. When you missionaried around the world, to tell someone about your religion, you would bring them into your nation, your family. So nationalization was what it was still being part of their construct. This is a quotation from Jeremias. He's a New Testament scholar of a generation ago. The most obvious defect of the Jewish mission lay in its insistence on the inseparable connection between religion and national custom. It's everything we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. Religion and custom went together. Conversion to the Jewish religion meant nothing less than nationalization, becoming a Jew. The Jewish mission was at the same time national propaganda. Obvious as are these limitations, they in no way minimize the significance of the fact that Jesus grew up with a people actively engaged both by spoken and written word in the Gentile mission. They wanted people to become Jewish. See how I have to be careful there? When I say righteous, well, they can be righteous. No, we want them to become Jewish. And that was a problem that we are seeing firsthand here in the intertestamental period. Again, so what if this person wants to come across and become part of the family? Welcome over. As long as you keep all this, you're in. Now, you're still proselytized. You're not really. There's some division of thought on this. Did Jews really welcome a Ruth? We tend to think so. She becomes part of the genealogy of David. But there is a sense, again, as you go back through the stories, that there's still something missing just because you have pagan blood in you. Number 7, well, into this world would walk the Jewish Messiah, or so they thought. In the intertestamental period, as we close it out, what do the Jews expect the Messiah to do? You could fill this in now that you've gone through this far. What's he going to do? 2 things. He would rid Israel of the other, being the hope of national renewal and the hope of Gentile destruction. I can't wait for you, Messiah, whoever you are, to get rid of the Gentile. And that's the story of Nicodemus. Again, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, a man comes knocking at night and sits down, has a wonderful conversation. I'd love to have heard the whole thing. And Jesus adds, after the most famous verse in the world, what Nicodemus was expecting, but not expecting, right? God loved the world, gave his only begotten Son. For God didn't send his Son into the world to do the very thing you thought he was going to do. Just so you know, this is Jesus. Either Jesus said this, or the writer is adding this in as a editorial comment. Remember that Jesus sitting in front of Nicodemus is giving Nicodemus something he never saw coming. And that is a gentle, loving, kind, godly, yes, Messiah who's not going to say, pow to the Gentile. He's going to put his arms out and say, welcome to the family. So it's going to be a whole new picture for them. This is a very technical point, but I have to say it because, and if you're a nerd when it comes to Bible languages, you'll like this, but hang on, I'll go through it fast. Number 8, you have to go through this in some sense to make sense of Jesus' life. During this time, the gods of the Old Testament were lost, but only in translation. Here's why. Where we would expect theos, the Greek word for deity, in the Septuagint, or the New Testament, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew, 200 BC. So this predates this by 200 years. This is the Old Testament in Greek, and of course this is New Testament Greek. So they're both Greek, And this is 200 years newer, or precedes it by 200 years, okay? Where we would expect to see the Greek word theos, we sometimes, not always, but sometimes get the word angelos, and you've never met one of them because that's a Greek term. In medieval English, we transliterate that into angel. But angels, again, that's an English term that the Bible never knew about. What is an angelos? It's a messenger deity. Or it's a messenger, sometimes a deity. Here's just, again, for you language nerds, some background to this. When you have the Old Testament, some classic verses that talk about Elohim, or sons of God, right? B'nai Elohim. Well, when you get to the Septuagint, they start putting in the word angelos in place of Elohim. Angelo to theou means or angelos of God. Why would you say, if it says B'nai Elohim, why would you translate it as, in the Septuagint, as angeloi? Because they, in their language, they're just the way they thought, well, that's a messenger deity. You could do it in Job 5, Job 38. My point is, again, these words for Hebrew words for deity, like Elohim, Kedoshim, they turn into angeloi, angelos, and the word then becomes angel in several hundred years hence. And you can do this with Psalm 8. God made him, or you have made him a little lower than the gods. In Hebrew, it's Elohim. But in the Septuagint, all of a sudden you get angelos, and thus angel starts to show up there. And Daniel the same way. This I like this one, of course. The four men are walking in the fire. The aspect of the fourth is like a son of the gods in Aramaic for Daniel, Bar Elohim. The Septuagint changes it to angels of God, or angelu theou. And that's why in the New Testament, again, the gods are still there, but they have been translated in time between the testaments into angels. I like to say it this way. I don't believe in angels. I believe in gods. And how do I say, or how can I defend that? Because the word angel is a translation that was done between the testaments unfairly, improperly. They had no business changing this or this to this, but somebody did. We're going to meet the gods again very quickly when we turn to Jesus, and he walks into a synagogue and a man has a demon, and they have their conversation. You'll see how that's God language that we're talking there. Proposition number 9 in the intertestamental period, king, and he was crowned or given the title king in 37 BC by Rome. Herod wasn't a king. He just wanted the title. He's a half Jew, and you know King Herod the Great as a wicked man. We only know the half of it, I'm sure. A terrible man. He paganized Jewish worship in his rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. My point is this: when Jesus goes to the temple, which the text has very little of him ever going, mostly in John, you get the sense, and it's a proper sense, he's not going to a welcoming place. This is not worshiping Yahweh. Beautiful temple redone by Herod, greatly expanding what Solomon even had ever done. And it's not sacred space to him, to Jesus. He knew, in fact, as I say here, with Herod's help, he made the Judaism of the New Testament period minimally Yahwist. Herod populated the temple with Egyptian priests, Mesopotamian priests. So when Jesus went to the temple, and the text never says that he sacrifices at the temple, and I don't blame him. Jesus knew that place with the insignia of Rome right on the front, an eagle crest, this is for the gods of Rome. I know it was given to us as Jews that we would be happy with it, but Herod the half-Jew was simply paganizing the religion of Israel's forefathers. And so my whole point here, and I'm ready to move on to number 10, but I just want to clarify that when you see the temple and talk about the priests and such in the New Testament, it is extremely pagan. There's nothing remotely godly going on in that place. And just read the New Testament record of what Jesus felt about it when he goes in and throws over the tables. That's how he felt about that temple at that time. It was not sacred space to Jesus at all. Well, my last one for this module, The last scene of the intertestamental period is actually the first word spoken in the New Testament, right? The New Testament hasn't been written yet. And John the Baptist is on the side of the river, and he's baptizing people or welcoming them into the movement of the Messiah, a Messiah he has not even met yet. He doesn't know who it is. But he's welcoming people to take the plunge, to identify with this movement of expectation of somewhere here close by the Messiah is going to show, and we want to be ready for him. But notice, how do I say this? The opening scene, John the Baptist noticed that Israel had ceased being the family of Abraham. You've got to know that going into the story to make sense of Jesus' life. Qualifying now as a family of Satan. So that's literally how he says it. You offspring of snakes, probably referring back to Genesis 3. This whole concept of a snake being used by the satanic figure of Genesis 3 to get involved in the human race. You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come. Don't even go down the line of saying we have Abraham as our father. I don't want to hear that. That's strong language. That means you're not a Yahwist. I'm speaking to people who claim Jewish heritage and they're not even in the family. Very strong language. Where does that come from? It comes from this whole story of the intertestamental period. So that's the point of this module. Now we turn happily to the coming of Jesus, and we'll do that with our next module.